Hi, I'm John Atack, and I have as my guest yet again the great good fortune to have Rio Harada-Parr. Hi, Rio.
Hello, nice to see you again.
Likewise. And you're studying philosophy at the moment, is that right?
Yes, I am studying philosophy at the moment.
Yeah. So we're
most
not
useful degree.
Yeah. But you're also a highly competent pianist, a classical guitar player, and a drummer. And you've been doing that since you were born, pretty much.
Yeah. I started on the drums. Well, I mean, my parents like to say, he had his early musical experience at the age of 1 when he went to see a drum kit and played on it for multiple hours, sort of thing. But my firm started to music, so it was like when I was about 6. And then sort of strange thing happened that each instrument I picked up afterwards, each thing I picked up afterwards became the main thing over the thing that had come before it. So I sort of started with drums, ended up writing music, and they sort of all inverted places, so composition, piano, guitar. And then, unfortunately, drums somewhere down here now. Though my love for drumming has remained pretty strong in like all the music I listen to, at least. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's a good basis. I knew a guy called Joe Partridge who, along the way, played guitar for Elton John. Lovely, absolutely lovely guy. And he said that he played the drums as a kid, and that had given him the basis from which to play the guitar, and that he felt that having that acute timing marked the really great guitar players from the rest. So I think Segovia probably played the drums when he was a kid, So.
Yeah. Every single one, Actually, John Williams on the drum kits, not quite.
Incredible. Julian Bream on the tambourine.
Yeah. On the tambourine. I feel like he'd be quite good on the tambourine, actually.
I think he'd be good at anything. I saw a masterclass that he did, and it was just astonishing the sensitivity that he has to every little note and flourish that happens. Really amazing man. But and because he was Segovia's pupil.
Yeah.
So now we've confused our audience completely.
Yeah.
You brought up the topic before we started of virtuosity. And would you like to sort of open with that, or would you like me to drone on at people about it?
I was drawing sort of on what you were saying, so I think it might be nice if you put forward what you think about virtuosity first, and then we can sort of take it from there. That's all right.
Well, I think it's a very wide topic. Firstly, in the 20th century, there was a tremendous move against virtuosity, which actually came out of socialist and communist ideas, that, or indeed out of theosophy, which again could be quite political. So Mondrian, who was a follower of a guy called Schoenmakers, who was developed the neoplastic theory, neoplasticism, and Mondrian must have an incredible effect upon painting. He comes up with this idea that abstract painting must be non-objective. There must be nothing that looks like an object in the painting. It's the law. It's the rule. If you break this rule, you will go to Mondrian hell. And I'd love to go to Mondrian hell, because Mondrian heaven is just grids of black lines with white, blue, yellow, and red. And but the idea was that he was creating an art that anybody could do. And that was passed on up to, say, the op artist Anuskewitz, who most people have perhaps not heard of, but he I think produced very interesting work. But he again thought that you've got to completely exclude any personal uniqueness, and anything that required more than a basic level of skill from the arts. Now, this hits very hard, as you know, in musical composition. After the Second World War, I think there's this sense after the First World War that human beings are fundamentally evil, and the arts kind of take a dip into the more somber and melancholy at that point. And during the Depression, in the 30s, you have this brilliant, bright new art coming up called jazz, and it's sort of that's considered frivolous, and then people like Duke Ellington come along, and it's very hard to dismiss Ellington as frivolous. In fact, many people regard him as the greatest American composer. He's certainly in the top 5. But after the Second War, I think in painting, it's exemplified by the work of Wols, Wols, who actually was in Auschwitz. And the sense is, how can you possibly celebrate anything knowing the horrors of the Second World War? And it sort of, technique fell away, craft fell away. And in painting, by the time I went to college in the 70s, nobody would teach you, for example, how Titian painted. His famous statement about using glazers 30 or 40, building up translucent layers of paint to gradually model something. That was all gone. Even the painting materials that had been used, the oil paints, were replaced by plastic paint, which cannot. It doesn't have the capacity to create the inner light, the inner luminosity that oil paints can. I use a plastic oil paint, an alkyd paint, which can do it. But I mean, the other thing is, if you make a brush mark with a water-based paint, the water will evaporate and the mark will collapse. So you won't be left with the mark. And Rembrandt would have been very annoyed about that.
Yeah.
And you've got this thing of like, well, we're going to bounce the cello up and down on the floor to make a sound, and we're going to, this is, it's all fine, I don't care what people do. Painting gradually disappeared as conceptualism took over.
Yeah.
And you got some brilliant conceptualists. I mean, Marcel Duchamp at the beginning of the idea, at the beginning of just about everything, op, pop, surrealism, Dada. He begins it all. Great man. Also a chess master in his spare time. But you get something like Maurizio Cattelan. I think his work, the toilet, America, the gold toilet, the banana taped to the wall. I understand that. That makes sense to me. But when I look at Tracy Emin or Damien Hirst or Jeff Koons, I just think they're taking the piss. With Maurizio Cattelan, I see or Duchamp, I see a profound intelligence playing games and bringing about insight, when they deliberately had the banana eaten in the gallery. And he said, well, no, I'm selling the idea. So you have to get a fresh banana anyway, but it'd be $150,000. And you have to provide your own tape apparently too. But the idea is going to cost you this much. And he sold several of them. So
it's like millions or something.
By now, banana trade has just gone crazy. People love bananas now. They never used to have them before.
The treatment of Central America in, what was it? I can't remember now. The country that was turned into that banana
Republic.
Banana Republic, yeah.
It's Honduras that the United Fruit Company overthrew the government with the help of the CIA and Richard Milhouse Nixon.
The most surreal coup ever, possibly, because it was for bananas. Cattelan was behind it.
And probably inspired Woody Allen's movie Bananas in some ways, which is not one of his greatest works, but there you go. So the other part of it is that when you look back to somebody like Michelangelo, who was in his own time revered not only as a painter, a sculptor, and an architect, but also as a poet. So he was a bit of a show-off. That you have this with him, or say Bernini or Da Vinci, you have this incredible development of skill. It's almost unparalleled. It's very difficult to, see anybody much rising to the abilities that these individuals had. And you can get the idea that the aesthetic, the artistic, is a purely skill-based idea at one end, and at the other end you've got Mondrian, who's stopping the rest of us from 98% of visual imagery is now banned because of the law of neoplasticism, which, by the way, actually it's real. It really happened that you can be told off. I paint pictures that people can see things in. We can't have that, Well, and it's not my interest that they should hallucinate. That's their business, but I'm interested in the color, the shape, the form, but I'm not allowed to. There's this whole area that's not meant to happen. But so at one end you've got virtuosity, at the other end you've got a kind of cult of inadequacy, a kind of competence is a bad thing. Uniqueness, that's the problem. Individuality, that becomes individualism. That's separating out from the great mass of humanity. So what we see is that political views and philosophical views intrude upon what we're allowed to enjoy. And I suppose the final point in that would be Raymond Williams and his work in the 50s, where he's a completely unknown guy in some little provincial college, and he writes a book in which he says there really is no difference between high and low culture. It's all a matter of opinion. And he's offered a professorship at Cambridge because this is such a clever idea. And I tend to go with that what people like is up to them. And it's not, if they happen to like country and Western music, I don't have to sit in the same room with them. Unless, of course, it was T-Bone Burnett, in which case I'm perfectly happy to sit in the same room with them. But there are a few ideas for you to play with now that we've opened that up.
Sure.
Reflect.
There's a lot to talk about there. So, I mean, I suppose the one thing I'd open up with, and it's always something that interests me. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned sort of philosophy intruding upon the arts and vice versa. Because arts sometimes intrude upon, well, not intrude is the wrong way of putting it, because philosophy sort of, I've always seen as sort of the basin in which everything else sort of takes place, right?
I agree.
Any field, generally speaking, has some philosophy underlying it, though when it comes to things like psychology or things like that, I feel like there's more of or language, there's more of like a paradoxical relationship, because sometimes they can undermine each other simultaneously, which I think is quite interesting.
And of course, when we start with the idea of philosophy in Greece, you have natural philosophy, which is what we would call science. And it covers all of the sciences and the idea of investigating things. And then you have metaphysics, as Aristotle called it, which is the other bit, where we're trying to work out what's going on. And all of the subjects are they're just compartments within the overarching idea of philosophy. That's what the Greeks thought. Nothing's changed my mind about that.
Sort of schema that everything comes from, right? The thing that I find interesting, though, is with aesthetics and artists in general, up until the 20th century, there was sort of like discussions of aesthetics, and then of artists doing painting, or composers composing music, and there was a sort of like a contradiction. Like they weren't really discussing very much. I mean, with Beethoven, that sort of changes.
And how?
Because I mean, Beethoven's such a fascinating figure in sort of classical music in so many different ways. He had the technique, but he also had the incredible ambition to turn that technique into something that was historically fascinating.
I mean, he adds another dimension to music. There's no, he sees something that's never been seen before. If you listen to Mozart, Telemann, Vivaldi, Haydn, everything that leads, Bach, all these wonderful things, it's like he suddenly says, "Have you seen this?"
I mean, especially coming from the back end of the classical era, where it was a lot, music wasn't, there was a sort of like the tension was between the composer who wanted to enjoy writing music and then the audience who was sort of using it quite a lot of time for like parlor music, essentially.
Absolutely. The idea that Haydn had to have his fingernails checked before he went and performed because he was a servant, and that they're having to, why did Mozart write so much music? Why did Bach write so much music? Because they had to have something new for every season, The idea of them, continuing to play this music hundreds of years later would have been very odd to Mozart.
And also with the religious music sort of died down a little bit at that point, or sort of gone into its own area.
And that too, that the tradition had been for centuries that you had the propers and the ordinaries in the mass, and the ordinaries were repeated every day, but there had to be new propers for every saint's day, and every day is a saint's day. So the polyphonic composers like Thomas Tallis, William Byrd, Gombert, so many of these brilliant people, they weren't really composers, they were arrangers. They got the same text, the liturgy, but they had to come up with something new for the propers every day. They couldn't go back to what they'd done the year before necessarily, because the idea was, we want something new and shiny. So it was much more like the Beatles on Merseyside, than this kind of vaunted idea of these high, brilliant people. Same with painting. It said that up until Botticelli in Florence, the painters were the second rank of artists because tapestries took so much longer to make, and painters would be paid by the weight of ultramarine vermilion, the expense, and gold, the expensive things they'd used, and by the hour for what they'd done. And my painting tutor, I don't know if it's true, told me that Sandro Botticelli, everything changed. And he said, think of him like a footballer. Think of him like a great football star. His paintings would be paraded through the streets, with all of this. And out of that, we've created, where art was turned over. I think with Napoleon, you get this thing that, maybe this old stuff's worth something again. Maybe this Egyptian stuff, just as the Renaissance, so-called, had started with them looking at Greek and Roman statues, which had lost their paint. So they thought everything had to be white marble, and it's all been gaudy, horrific sort of stuff with lipstick on it. But this kickstarted a new way of thinking, which was actually completely inaccurate. It didn't reflect what had happened in the classical era, which was a brutal, terrible time. It wasn't the foundation of the great civilization. So you get these mistakes, this mistaken perception of the past, which then, or where you have an intermixture of cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So the way the Impressionists saw ukiyo-e prints, which were being used to wrap porcelain that was coming from Japan. They were just, it was just waste paper, and they opened them out, and that tremendously influenced, particularly Paul Gauguin and Van Gogh, and the whole post-impressionist movement. You have all of these, the different significance that is suddenly given to something. Mm-hmm. The way that we change how we view the past, and their idea, through the Renaissance, through the Baroque, was what's the new stuff? What's the new stuff?
Mm-hmm. And then classical period, you have the sort of, well, before the classical, you have the tendency of galant music and sort of people who are trying to push harmony further, and eventually galant wins out, and we sort of end up with, I'm also inspired by sort of, classical architecture as well. It's interesting you mentioned the classical architecture because, the idea of classical music was a lot of order and all about, technique and a lot about transposing key more than it was about necessarily playing with that much complex harmony within the structure. But obviously the greats, this is a sort of a hard and fast rule. There are examples in Haydn or Mozart where the harmony is incredibly exciting.
Yes.
So generalizations are still generalizations, is essentially what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. But you also have your misapprehensions, so that the temple front, that triangular form that we see at the National Gallery and in so many other places, was actually misunderstood, I'm told. And it takes something from the past, misunderstands it, and then gives it to the present as if it's a piece of learning. I mean, an interesting example, the manuscripts of Hermes Trismegistus, which were very important in the creation of the Renaissance. Mm-hmm. And they're pretty much like the Illuminati, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, these secret societies that construct themselves. And what happens is some confidence trickster, Ossian's another example of it, who inspired Mendelssohn and Grieg. Some confidence trickster comes along, writes a document, claims it came from Egypt, and this now, the intelligentsia form a secret society. I mean, it's said that the encyclopedists in France were Freemasons. And you sort of, well, didn't they understand that this was a made-up cult? But it's like, oh no, it's a secret society that we're part of. And so you've got this other strange dynamic that's functioning about, we are the elect, we are the special people. And century by century, you have some cult of people who believe abject nonsense that they're quite sure goes back to Egypt. And Leonardo da Vinci was always a member of whatever cult Dan Brown is talking about. And they build a sense of superiority upon that. Mondrian inverted that and said the superiority comes from, getting modern. I don't know if you know this, but Mondrian used to dress up in a suit to paint. And he used to put on ragtime records because they were really modern, and dance around in his suit while he put the paint on. And that to me is a lovely image, it's
like the opposite of Jackson Pollock, This is like really fast jazz, completely drunk out of his mind,
Yeah, I do get into arguments with people about Pollock. I really do, because I liked his work as a painter. I liked his work because there it was in the books, and then I saw his work face to face, and it was just awful.
It's the worst possible inversion with painting. You know, the ideal is you see it in the book, you go, "This is really great," and then you go and see it in real life, you go, "Wow, this is even better than I thought it was going to be."
Yeah, almost always.
You know,
but not with Jackson Pollock.
No, I mean, with his wife, his partner, I saw sort of exhibition at the Barbican, and I was impressed by that.
Oh.
So one of those, you know, rare cases where, you know, the sort of revival of, you know, former artists in the past, you know, unfortunately, you know, female artists, where it was like, wow, this actually is really brilliant stuff, and I was very excited by that. But yeah, Pollock isn't quite my kettle of fish, and he sort of isn't the same or even at all similar to many of the other abstract artists that he was around at the time either. So it's very strange, the entire movement, to be honest, because there's not that much coherency.
There's none. I mean, what happened was Clement Greenberg, the critic, was paid large amounts of money by the CIA. It's all documented. The instructions, the banknotes, everything has become available. And the CIA, under Bill Donovan, when it founded in 1947, you know, revived the OSS then. They decided that the real threat was that communism would take over throughout Europe. And so they did a variety of things. They created a left-behind intelligence organization, which has many names. One of them is Gladio. And they gave them a huge amount of Krugerrand gold bars and said, don't report to us, don't tell us anything, you've got to be secret. And this organization flourished for decades and created such things as Ordo Nuevo in Italy, which murdered 9 policemen, which came out in court cases. So you got this left behind organization that was going to fight communism, and they got really bored. The Order of the Solar Temple was an offshoot of Gladio, the cult that committed suicides in Canada, Switzerland, and France. All sorts of weird things happened there. But at the other end, you've got the idea, well, if France collapses, then it would be safer for the Centre of the Arts to be New York. And a systematic campaign was created. And the Taquist movement in Paris was grabbed hold of, and that became what would be called abstract expressionism, what is wrongly called action painting. And the simple idea of Taquism is basically that every individual has a signature. They have a facture, it's the arty word for it, that belongs to them. So you have individualism again. And Pollock basically meets with André Masson, who's over from France. Masson gathers this group of people together. None of them, as you say, there are no two who are thinking the same way or doing the same thing. Klein, you know, is nothing to do with Pollock, or Motherwell, who comes immediately afterwards. They share nothing other than the same public relations agent, Clement Greenberg, and a huge wad of cash pouring through to claim that they are the great new artists. Pollock, to me, he's a guy who pastiched Archil Gorky, who was a pretty good painter. He pastiched Picasso. He didn't pastiche them particularly well. You can see that he's copying them. Then he finds out about Navajo sand painting. He completely misunderstands what that's about, that it's a sacred thing, that is a healing thing, you know, that's meant to do some good. Drinks enormous amounts of alcohol and dips sticks into car enamel paint, which is then dribbled over cotton canvas. So most of these things are actually coming apart, even though they're now the highest priced paintings in the world. The car enamel paint will burn through. Picasso made the same mistake. It will burn through the canvas. And when you're restoring an old canvas, say you've got a Rembrandt and it needs a bit of a brush up, you float it in a bath and the paint will come away from the canvas or the poplar wood support that it's on. Isn't that a great idea? Oh dear, we've gone wrong with the Rembrandt. It's gone down the plug hole. You float it off and then you put it onto a new support, you know, usually a wooden support, can be canvas. Well, if the car enamel paint has penetrated the support, the cotton canvas. Cotton has a life of about 50 years. It's a really bad material. I use linen, which has about 500 years. If it's penetrated it and burned into it, you can't separate it. So you can't restore them. Broadway Boogie Woogie by Mondrian, perhaps his most famous work, he never finished it. And there are little strips of tape where he meant to paint, and they're coming off. So, yeah, that's the beauty. It's almost like Man Ray and his idea of the object to be destroyed, he called the piece when he first made it. And after a few years, he changed its name to Indestructible Object. And it's kind of this ephemeral art that was created by Pollock and others that is actually deteriorating so rapidly that they'll have to make copies of it in decent modern materials and pretend they're the originals. Because when you've paid $150 million for something, you don't want to have to throw it away.
It talks the weird relationship between money and art as well, you know.
Oh,
The most, because I mean, to be honest, big statements here, but essentially the modern art industry in quite a lot of senses is just sort of money laundering for rich people at this point.
yeah,
where they just keep expensive paintings in sort of warehouse, they just switch them around to avoid paying taxes.
It's not even paintings anymore. I was in LA in, I think it was 91, and it was my habit to visit many galleries because I was desperately trying to sell my own work. And the first year I went around in 86, I got people going, oh yeah, I really like these are really good, but they're watercolors and we can't sell watercolors. And the next time I went around, it was like, oh yeah, we like these are really good. Do you live in California? Every gallery, do you live in California? No, well, bugger off then. Then, the next time, the third time, which I think was 91, I went around and almost every gallery on La Cienega Boulevard in LA, where the gallery district used to be, had installations, Russian installations. And I really admire the Russian artists. I have tremendous admiration for them because they could be sent to the gulag if they were caught. So they were like Ai Weiwei. I don't like his work. I'm sorry, I just don't like it. But I really admire him because he took his life in his hands. He's now left mainland China. Because what he was doing was a protest against, the horrors of the Chinese fascist state. So I admire that. Same with the Russians. I admire them for the statement they made. But the statement they made was, this is my studio. And they called it an installation. And it looks like most of the artist studios I've seen are complete shambles, stuff all over the place. So I, after about the third or fourth one of these, I said to the gallery dealer, let me see if I've got this right. This is the artist studio. It's an installation. And what will happen is it's been carefully photographed. There's a blueprint of it, and it will be put in a safety deposit box, and it will never see the light of day again. It will just be sold from the photographs. And to my amazement, the dealer said, yep. And and that's where we've come to. Yeah. The emperor's new clothes. There's no emperor.
No clothes,
nothing. No.
Yeah. It reminds people of the sort of biggest problems of, and I think this is where, though not impervious to it, music has, well, I say music has done better, but classical music's only done sort of slightly better in the sense that it is almost wholly unpopular. It has about zero financial power. So, it's contemporary classical music has sort of survived and kept itself in sort of vague tact in some areas, not because of any, because they have literally no influence. So you'd have to be committed to go into it. You'd have to like it. And to be honest, coming from someone who was trying to be a composer for a while, and talking to quite a lot of the young people who, are now studying composition in conservatoires, there's this strange admission where everyone goes, I don't really like this, do you? And they all sort of, everyone in the room starts saying, and even the person who, was the head of it sort of goes, oh, no, well, and they're laughing along with the joke. They're not explicitly saying they agree, but it's like, this is getting a bit suspicious. Though interestingly, in classical music, the relations are a bit different, but the sort of outcome of the postmodern condition in art, and sort of the sort of scrapping of objectivism and relativism, sort of coming forward, which I don't necessarily see as a problem, I've always sort of asked the question, now that you've said, okay, we don't need to have technique, now what do you actually want to see? Which I think is a very simple question, right? It's like, yes, this could be art. So the definition of art is something I'll just get to in a little bit. They sort of go, well, you know, you could make that, yeah, sure. And I'm not going to say that's not art, but I don't want to look at it. Do you want to look at it? You know, it's a good question.
Well, let me give a simple analogy. I'm not at all against conceptualism. As say, I really admire Catalan and Duchamp and what have you. But here's a choice. If we just take away all aesthetic theory, all ideas of what we're meant to do and not meant to do, I'm going to offer a choice. Choice is this. You come into a kitchen, there's a table there, and I'll give you a choice. You can either, on that table, have a vase of flowers or a pile of dog shit. Which do you choose? Now, using theoretical constructs, you of course have to choose the dog shit, you know, because that's the high art part of it. But if you have any humanity left in you, you go, cool, that stinks. I want the flowers. And at that point, you've become, you know, a lesser human being, because you're trying to use your senses to enjoy things rather than the fine organ of your mind. You know, so with conceptualism, it's become more philosophy than aesthetics.
Yeah, I mean, also conceptualism. This is sort of where I actually have a big problem that conceptualism goes in art galleries. It's not it. You know, I meet sort of people who you know, and their concerns are very, very understandable. Who sort of go, how could you ever consider this art? And I actually know you, fair enough, because it isn't of the same category. They're not the same being. They are just different. You might as well consider them different mediums. They're as different as music is to painting. No, actually, they're more different.
Yes.
And frankly, a lot of it just sums up to being very badly written philosophy, which you have to read from a book, which, you know, is written by an artist who's hurriedly sort of woken up and discovered that French intellectualism happened in the 20th century. You know, he quickly read a few quotes of Derrida, completely not understood it because no one understands it, and then quoted it and went, now this is a conceptual piece of art with some meaning. And there are exceptions to this.
Yeah.
Obviously, I mean, it's not that the entire thing is full of hacks and frauds, but there's a very real sense in which it shouldn't. To put it next to a Monet makes very little sense from a phenomenological perspective, because they're different things.
Well,
you know,
Goethe put forward the idea, which is explored by Hermann Hesse in the Glass Bead Game, that there are 4 stages in art, and the first is a primitive stage, and here we see some very potent and powerful. Primitive just means first, primitivo, the spring. It's become a rude word, but if you'll get, you know, the Trafouet, Lascaux, the Altamira, the cave paintings, that's as primitive as you can get. Fantastic, powerful, potent art. Technique then develops, and you'll get something like the High Renaissance, where the, you know, technical abilities have become astonishing. Then you get what I call the wedding cake period, the Baroque or Rococo, where the technique is so elaborate that the beauty of the object is lost. You know, if you look at Rococo painting, and the words Baroque and Rococo really are interchangeable, but they're outside of, say, Tiepolo, there really isn't very much to look at anymore. That by the 18th century, painting is, you know, late 17th, 18th century, painting has degenerated into, you know, mannerism, and, you know, there's awful El Grecos and oh god, you know, where everybody's tortured, you know, the sadomasochism of Spanish painting. That's the Baroque. Everything becomes a great big super decorated wedding cake. The 4th period is the period of feuilleton, and that is the period of the journalist, the period where there is commentary upon art. And in the glass bead game, that becomes that the ruling caste are monks who have to live celibate lives and austere ascetic lives, and they play the glass bead game. And the pieces of the glass bead game, one side can represent a musical note, another can represent a specific painting, you know, and they play kind of this 3-dimensional dominoes And that's all that's left of art. Nobody can remember how to draw or paint or compose. And I think we did come close to that in music, that if we look back, Rimsky-Korsakov and his school, and Ravel, Boulanger, these are, they have learned how to do something to such a level of skill. You know, when Vaughan Williams realizes that he's got to go and study with Ravel if he's ever going to be, and he never does get to be as good at orchestration as Ravel, because nobody does. But Stravinsky, Prokofiev, Khachaturian, and
interesting techniques of their own as well. You know, in Stravinsky's case, especially, some very more detailed, not more detailed, sorry, but very detailed orchestration of Stravinsky as well. Fascinating sort of use of woodwinds. Which
comes out of Rimsky. That
it's all Rimsky.
It's not all Rimsky.
Whoa, big statement. But
he's got Rimsky, and he's understood Gesualdo and all of the great polyphony, and he's drinks enough to whatever it was that Stravinsky did. Apparently, was a bit of a drinker. He does, you know, and he can every 10 years say, right, well, I'm not doing that anymore, and create something else and something new, because his technique and his craft is so developed. That is lost almost. You know, I mean, in the 60s, we start getting, you know, John Tavener starts to be popular. And his work is certainly not as developed as any of the Russians, Shostakovich, for example. But it's interesting. Gorecki becomes popular just for the Third Symphony. Arvo Pärt becomes popular. And they're making some attempt to reconstruct music again. But the work of, say, David Diamond, the American composer, who maintains the tradition, is kind of pushed aside. Konstantin Lambert here. They don't, you know, all we've got to really hold on to, I think, after the Second World War is Benjamin Britten. You know, somebody who was, you know, kicked by the critics on a daily basis, but who just refused to listen and carried on moving forward without rejecting technique, without rejecting virtuosity in composition.
You see, I feel this is where we will have a disagreement.
Yes,
which is interesting.
too.
So, because I mean, this is sort of just like a larger scheme of the way I would see things here. I think one of the biggest problems to happen to art and music was, I mean, okay, in art, I think it was more to do with the fact that when you lost any framework, you know, any of these frameworks that we had in the past, which I don't think there's necessarily, you know, which might be valid in some ways, right? You know, it can be true that, you know, someone with less technique can do something better than someone with more technique. Like, that is a possible thing, you know, and we can sort of draw the metric. It depends on what you consider to be technique, which I think is an interesting question. But
let me give you an example quickly, and that would be Augustus John or John Everett Millais. These were people who, Millais won the Royal Academy Drawing Prize when he was 8 years old, you know, and then he did the Bubbles soap commercial for Pierce, you know, that you can have fantastic technique. Augustus John also, just astonishing technique, but so little of their work actually resonates. In music, it's like listening to Son House playing Death Letter and nearly destroying a National Steel guitar while he's doing it. And you go, well, that's actual emotion.
Yeah.
So technique can go too far.
So there's an interesting observation there. But then the issue is that and I'm surprised I didn't see this coming. No, I'm not actually, but they should have seen this coming. The issue is there is one value hierarchy that wasn't going to fall apart, which is obviously the economy. You know, it's like, yeah, you can reject all the value hierarchies you like, right? You can deinstitutionalize and say the institutes are wrong, but then you're just ceding the game over then to the pretty well, that and the CIA, the pretty cynical effects of capital. So I think that's what happened to the art and Soviet Union. It became, you know, this strange, like, really bad version of aesthetic Marxism, which makes literally no sense.
Socialist realism, and I mean that Lenin had both Chagall and Kandinsky in the Ministry of Culture when he declared them to be decadent and they had to run for their lives. And Goncharov, Lisitsky, Malevich, some of the great artists of the early 20th century became poster makers, because that was all they could do if they were to actually keep their lives.
Yeah,
And the same idea came up through the Nazis, National Socialism, and the fascists. This idea that art must be harnessed by the state as a tool of propaganda, and that it is dangerous. And they were right; it is dangerous. I think people like Banksy have shown how dangerous it can be, and the guerrilla artists, bless them,
I suppose this is where I would draw a distinct lineage, though. In music, what happened, I suppose, was a bit stranger, because the music of people like Arnold Schoenberg, leading into, I mean, who I love very much, though who's still kind of too modern for today in some ways, late stuff at least, though I do have sort of issues with serialism beyond that. Schoenberg, Webern, Berg, moving forwards into eventually you sort of get, when you mix some Messiaen in, and then you sort of add in, I don't want to say almost like a proto-fascist approach, which isn't fair to Boulez actually, because he's not really, he's sort of very anti-fascist initially, he sort of rose up in post-World War II France. But you sort of get this Boulez at the end, which is this integral serialism, this idea that, serialism obviously being the idea that you have this musical scale octave contains 12 notes, and you sort of order them all. You get something called a row, and you can only use one of these notes each time. Schoenberg's idea of emancipation of the dissonance. So whereas in America, you had something called dissonant counterpoint, which is where they wanted to create a new mode of expression. It was all about creating new things, modernism, right? Whether the idea was, instead of having consonances, you switch from dissonances. So where you'd have a perfect fifth, you'd have like, I don't know, a tritone, and so you'd have dissonant counterpoint. So it's like just tension and resolution, but inverted. Instead, Schoenberg's technique sort of leads you to the point where the ideas of tension and resolution sort of have fallen apart, which is sort of the full idea of atonality. And then sort of Boulez takes this forwards and goes, well, let's just do this to like loads of things. And it's not actually that strict in his music, to be fair to him, but that's the sort of idea. And we need to keep on going forwards. And so there's this sort of actually this like other lineage in music. And I think this actually shows that the degeneration of culture wasn't necessarily purely ideal in terms of like idea-based, because what we saw there was music sort of kind of getting into its circle. People like Adorno saying things like, who I have a very strained relationship with as a sort of thinker, because some of the stuff I think he's bang on about. So other stuff, when he talks about jazz, he should probably never speak ever again. And it's got that sort of strange, the problem with German modernism in music is that it's got that strange, slight racial supremacy thing running through it the whole time. Even with Schoenberg, who was Jewish, but had very strange relationships with Judaism and his own Jewishness. But so you get this other lineage. But then the interesting thing is what postmodernism does in music, in my opinion, is sort of weirdly actually liberates the form a little bit. This sort of modernist thinking isn't fully died in contemporary music. So, if you try and write a pop song, you get booted out. Or if you try and write sort of historical pastiche, you'll also get kicked out. Depends on who you are. If you're Schnittke and you do it in a very clever way, just Schnittke's just fantastic. But that's a different sort of, that's actually an example of musical postmodernism, I suppose, because and then I suppose for music, what it did is it allowed composers to break that barrier between the high culture and the low culture, quote unquote. And then that low culture they found happened to be really good, because when this happened, it was the 60s and the 70s. You had Jimi Hendrix, you had the Beatles, you had Stones, you had all these fantastic musicians, and then you generate, you get out of it composers like Steve Reich. He's probably the best of his little lot.
I think so. I had the incredible privilege of seeing him perform about 25 years ago. He came to Nottingham and did music for 18 musicians. I think some of Philip Glass's opera is good. But you bring me to a simple point, which is about consonance and dissonance. That in the West, a system was adopted that says, this is how it works, and it starts out with just the whole tones, the white notes, and then you get the half tones added in. The black notes are stuck in there, flats and sharps. And it doesn't work mathematically. I have a friend, had a friend, no longer with us, who, when he was at college, and I met him in his 70s, back in the 1980s, when he was at college, he realized that the octave as we have it set is irrational, and he wasn't going to put up with this. And he inherited a large amount of money, and he had a 500 tube xylophone made so that he could get accurate microtones. While I knew him, he had a guitar made with the frets so close together that, and this, it was a way of seeing that trying to conquer music rationally. If we then look to Chinese or Asian music in general, we find something that is quite other, quite different, because it doesn't accept the same set of scales. And we then sort of wander off into jazz, and we have the famous blue note. We have the flat notes that will be used. And we find, if you go and listen to La Voix de la Mystère Bulgare, and I've saw one of those troupes, and you are suddenly in different spaces and different things can happen. But there's always this thing of, what is the system that I'm used to? I find it attractive to listen to, say, Indian music, which is all monophonic. It's all just one note played at a time, and there are no tunes. They just, oh no, we play these 7 notes, and that evokes this feeling. This is a dawn raga or Pallavi or what have you. That music can be approached from all of these places. Reich and the other minimalists, John Adams and Glass, of course, they're influenced by the Balinese gamelan, by this percussion instrument that you don't actually need to have any skills to play.
And Debussy as well, influenced by gamelan, obviously, as well.
And Debussy is, there is no Stravinsky without Debussy. Debussy, I think, is foundational, or Ravel.
And his orchestrations as well for Debussy, which we get overlooked a little bit. They take a lot from Wagner, interestingly, though the cultural divide between the French and the Germans was still very active, but Debussy sort of hated Wagner, but
who doesn't?
You can hear his orchestration in Debussy's music. And
there again, Howard Goodall is very strong on the point that Wagner takes everything from his father-in-law. So that who didn't happen to have the compositional skill but had the ideas. And so I had this discussion with my partner the other week about horns, and I said, if you want to listen to horn orchestration, Sibelius, and she went Wagner. I'm sort of, no, Sibelius. But it's whether we end up with a music that, as with Son House, Death Letter, you can't resist that. He is singing about getting a letter telling him that his girlfriend is dead and he's being asked to come and view the body. And it gets you. And then you sit down and listen to Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, and it doesn't get you. That you have to engage in an intellectual process with it. And I think it's important to say that's a matter of choice. If somebody wants to, live inside a Mondrian, that's fine by me. If they want to try and persuade me that they have a superior culture to mine, then I will laugh at them. That it becomes complicated and significant because, as you say, economics then comes into the picture, and She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah sells rather more copies than C 148 times, or whatever it's called, by Stockhausen. And commerce will dictate. So against the horrified outcries of the critics, which we heard against Beethoven, of course, he was much despised in his time, and which we heard about jazz. Jazz was jungle music. It was going to make us all primitive. We were all going
to get jungle music, but yeah.
Yeah, we were all going to be smoking marijuana and having sex with people. And of course, that leads into breeding of the races, as we have seen. That was why cannabis was in fact made illegal in the
Mhm.
Western world, firstly in Canada in 1924, because it would sully the white race, because white women would want to sleep with black men. I don't know if there were any black men in Canada at this time, but it was such a horrifying thought. Culture
That-
changes, ideas change.
The incredible insecurity also of the white supremacists. They sort of assume that you introduce any bit of sort of so-called quote unquote black culture and suddenly all the women will leave them and they'll move to Africa and start sex cults or something. It's a very strange and quite funny if you really think about it carefully.
And at the moment, the white supremacists in the United States haven't worked out that Hitler would have massacred most of them, because they're Poles, they're Russians, they're not Aryans, so they'd be gone, And of course, the Japanese were Aryans, according to Hitler, who managed to work that out somehow. We'll make a deal somehow.
But I think the thing with saying about the modernism and stuff and the economy, it's interesting you sort of mentioned music, because this is where I sort of say there's a different mechanism going on there, because this sort of speaks to the difference of music and art as mediums.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, art, at least when it was, and also even street art, which was initially the sort of great hope for people's art. You can't buy and sell, this is on a wall, and it turns out, well, we just remove the wall, can't we? Which sort of has happened to Banksy.
Yeah.
Really, I just think this is the most surreal thing. The thing that sort of always helped music is that it always sort of escaped that same level of commercialization, because once you can mass produce it, at least scarcity wasn't the metric anymore, which meant that you were liberated from having to deal with material as such, which is something that I think music sort of has as a means that sort of avoids the same cynical inertias as art. Though
you had a similar process with etching and engraving in the 17th century, that Rembrandt produced as many etchings as he did paintings. And if you had a load of money, then you got the one-off original. You could get John Lennon to come round and play at your party. Or George Gershwin, more likely. It said, Groucho Marx, somebody said to him, the work of George Gershwin will live forever. And he said, yeah, as long as he's at the party to play it, will go on forever, I think was probably the expression. But that there have been different levels of reproduction. So for opera to keep functioning, it requires massive amounts of money to basically maintain what was an ephemeral form, because we're coming back to scores again. Every season would have seen a new score. You didn't keep playing these things. So there are forms of production and reproduction. And of course, with music, the other thing, of course, was the copyright law. That now come to the point where I think I don't remember which one of them played the bass, but in Chaz and Dave, courage, best rabbit, rabbit, rabbit. The bass player, it's said that his bass lines are more sampled than any other bass player. And James Brown, of course, is the most sampled person. So we've now got to into a form where, almost like feuilleton, where you piece together a form of art from existing fragments. And you then get sued by the people who initially created it. So the economic complexity of what you can and can't do, the idea that Randy California had really written Stairway to Heaven because it has the same progression in it as the song he used. I mean, how silly are we going to get? Will we ever, will we get to the point where, somebody has, I think they've taken every possible variant in the scale of C and put it out and voided copyright on any of it. It's been a conceptual gesture, if you like.
Yeah, some lawyers got together and put this like thing together. So, we're copywriting this because then you can't get us with the copyright, because there's been some really surreal copyright suits that happened in the last sort of 10 years, where like, and the worst ones are like where they have music that says this, you're stealing from me because I released this 5 years ago, and then you trace back a really short lineage. There was one example with Katy Perry where her song Dark Horse apparently sampled, well, no, infringed on the copyright of another person's song because it had a similar synth sound, and they played a repeated note pattern by something, with a few other changes in notes afterwards. The chord was slightly similar, I mean, yes, because everyone uses chords 1, 4, 5, and 6 because that's what people want to hear in pop music.
Oh.
I mean, I like, a few secondary dominants and chord change, but
what can I say?
But then the funny thing about that song is if you listen to the song and you know anything about 80s music, for example, you'll hear that he just took basically the sound that Moments in Love by the Art of Noise track and just basically took that sort of continuous riff and just makes his own version of that.
Yeah. And
so you get these weird copyright suits where like they're suing someone else for something that they've already stolen, and the entire idea of stealing an idea like that is just so utterly surreal. It's not new by any means, because you had classical composers being sued for things, but putting folk tunes, they thought they were folk tunes at least, and then it turns out these aren't folk tunes, these are tunes in copyright, and someone goes, we got you, whoever you are,
Well, it sounds yours, the black French composer, remarkable man. There's a complete section in a Mozart violin concerto that is his, because it was the thought, it will fit in here, I'll put it here, and it does fit in, it works very well. But there was no problem. Shakespeare, there isn't an original story in Shakespeare. Every one of them traces back to the point that with King Lear, the original play was performed 6 months before he reconstructed it and wrote a different version. And there are some questions there about what we might lose. I remember being very shocked when I first heard Traveling Riverside Blues by Robert Johnson, recorded, I think, in 1936. And there he is going, squeeze my lemon till the juice runs down my leg. I mean, but that's a Led Zeppelin song. How can you do that? And you go and look at your Led Zeppelin 2, and it says it was written by Page, Bonham, Plant, and Jones. They've never heard of Robert Johnson. They just accidentally used this thing. They later actually did perform Traveling Riverside Blues as well. And the other part of the song is Killing Floor by Howlin' Wolf, Chester Burnett. And I think Chester Burnett's successors did sue Led Zeppelin, and I think they won. But if you look at the album, it still says Page, Plant, Bonham, and Jones. That the musical borrowings were fine up until I think it was 1954 when the US joined the International Copyright Convention, and Willie Dixon, who was a brilliant double bass player, good singer, and involved in all sorts of songs, but he realized he could copyright all of the old blues songs, and he did. As well as writing some of them, but I don't think he did actually write Spoonful. I think that goes back somewhat further, but he, good businessman, economics and art.
Well, yeah, because I mean the copyright system is a sort of has been the travesty. Disney firstly, I think in the 90s, extended it by another, because they had to keep on all of it. Disney's an entire industry that's made their entire initial backlog out of old stories written by other people. Yeah. Now you can't use Mickey Mouse. And then recently, I think the Gershwin estate, because George Gershwin died a bit too young. Gershwin needs to come out of copyright. They went, no, let's make it to the person who also the lyricist. So now Ira Gershwin died, I think 1970 or something, it was around then, and so now it's going to be another like 40 years before those tunes are copyright. God.
But there's the natural period is 50 years, so that the Hendrix copyrights went void on September the 18th this year, and it'd be interesting to see how the battle develops. But you're right, Elvis Presley. In the US, you register for 25 years, then you register again for 25 years. Mm-hmm. And as you say, they found ways around it by saying, it was arranged by this person who didn't die until 2 months ago. Mm-hmm. Or, what's his name? Ub Iwerks, is that his name? The guy that actually drew all of the Disney characters. None of them drawn by Disney. Mm-hmm. But this guy, I think it's Ub Iwerks. He went to school with Disney, and he drew Mickey Mouse, he drew Donald Duck, he drew Pluto. He was just the guy, and none of it is credited to him. Mm-hmm. So that pulls us off into kind of the Robert Fripp King Crimson view, which is that Fripp believes it should be illegal to sell copyright.
Mhm.
That what you have made belongs to you forever. So if you buy a King Crimson album, the guy that did the cover art gets his 1%, or whatever, which might be taking it a bit far.
Yeah.
But I love Robert Fripp, even though he's into the law of attraction. I mean, how stupid can you get?
Yeah.
Just pray for things and they will come along your way.
I suppose with that though, Robert Fripp's an interesting other thing, because Robert Fripp is, I don't agree with all the things he says about culture either. But I think this
just shut up talking and play.
yeah. But I think this draws like to the most. For me, what I always found for art, just to return the definition of art, said I was going to say it earlier. Might as well say it now.
We believe.
For me, I always think the best way of analyzing art, which I suppose is sort of like a non-traditional way of looking at it. And I think it's actually quite obvious, and I think it's not exactly even like a revelation in some ways, but it does clear the air a little bit, I think, which is it's best to view art as a sort of as a sort of experience mediated by a thing, rather than being something we can define in sort of physical third person objective terms, because for me at least, it deals a lot of the problems that we've sort of encountered so far, right? Which is that the authorial intent doesn't seem to match up with our values or our principles. They do match up with our values and principles, and we hate it, which is another problem. So this sort of author-based way of looking at what is art, good art, bad art, in that sense, seems to be very unuseful. And then also, this is sort of, I'm not sort of talking about this at all yet, but I feel like it's when you have an experience of something of nature, an experience of certain sounds in nature, or certain things you see in nature, there's a sense in which those are profoundly beautiful and artistic experiences, even if we can't strictly call them art. It feels like it's best to sort of define art at the point of experience rather than at the point of creation, or the point of the person, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, it was at the point of creation or intention. I absolutely agree with you that the aesthetic experience, if we call it that, art signifies artifice and manufacture and creation, and therefore I think of as a human thing, unless of course one accepts that God created the world, in which case it's God's art. But I've not met him, so not yet, so I just don't know. So for me, there is a distinction between that which is artifice and is created by human beings, and that which is natural. There's a kind of world in between where you look at something like a termite mound and you go, well, there's a piece of architecture for you. I mean, it's got these blades at the bottom, so it's always cool at the bottom, even though it's in the desert. It's like, how the hell did they work that out? These little things that have got two brain cells. It's beyond me. But that there is the experience, and that experience, as you say, can be mediated by culture. That I can be, Paul Clay said, all you need to understand art is a chair, because otherwise your legs will get tired. And it's an important point that you have to actually look, and that we're in a culture that wants to talk about rather than look. So people will explain a painting to you, and that's great. But for me, until I've spent half an hour, and I mean half an hour, doing nothing but looking at a painting, I haven't begun to appreciate what's going on in it. But somehow there are these things. I had the great good fortune to go to the Prado in Madrid last year, and there was a Velázquez, two Saseos in there, Velázquez crucifixion. And I'm not particularly keen on sadomasochistic art. It's not that. But this thing was so beautifully handled. The paint was, it made me weep, and there I'm having an experience. This is where we insert James Joyce into the conversation. It had to happen sooner or later. The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, he says there are three forms of art. The first is pornographic. This is art that it draws you towards it and you wish to possess. It doesn't mean it's got any sexual aspect to it. It's stuff you want to have and own. Then there is art that is repulsive, that drives you away. This is didactic. This is art that's trying to teach you something, which I feel much of conceptualism is. It's trying to teach me something. And what it's trying to teach me is something I probably worked out when I was about 7 years old. You know, these people are not necessarily intellectually very well developed.
Yeah, and also, just quickly on the didactic art, it really misses the point of why it's art. The whole point of art is why it can be an experience that teaches you something. And you seem to see it in some art, right? You know, you go, wow, this has changed my, I have had my mind not changed, but my way of seeing something changed by an engagement. Well, no, yeah, changed by an engagement with a piece of art. But that's not because it sort of went through, because of, I had to sort of read it to understand it, and then I had a sort of cognitive distance between my mind telling me I should enjoy it and I don't enjoy it. It wasn't through that. It was through usually actually quite a raw, visceral moment of realization or powerful sort of impact where you go, oh, of course, this all makes sense now, you know? But yeah, sorry, continue.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the third form, which for Joyce is true art, which is what he calls transcendent art. That's the art that makes you stop. And you know, Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus, Holbein's Ambassadors, Rembrandt's Girl Standing in Water, all in the National Gallery in London. And I dare anybody who has eyes to not be put stock still by what you're looking at in these three astonishing works. But of course, there will be people who won't have that experience. The same with music, as you say, with something like Messiaen, where you've got, you know, he's a super Catholic, you know, this is hardcore Catholicism you're listening to here. But there will be that moment, you know, if you're listening to Thomas Tallis's Spem and Allium, where you've got 40 different melodies happening at the same time, and the so-called false relations where some other dimension, a rip in space-time happens and your head goes into it. That's transcendent. It takes you beyond words, it takes you beyond theories, beyond descriptions, and into awe, into the sense of wonder, which we can get from, you know, my friend Yuval Noah has really dug into this, but you can get it from the massive size of something. You can get it from the tininess of something. You can get it from the virtuosity and skill of another human being. But that overwhelming sense of, I am in this present moment experiencing this, rather than in the chatter and babble of my mind, you know, where somebody's trying to teach me something, or somebody's, you know, and too late, frankly, for that with me, or somebody's, you know, trying to make me want something. Those things happen. You know, what we might dismiss as pop music is probably the music is pornographic in James Joyce's terms. You know, you want to, you know, I remember there was a terrible song called Rocking Goose, which goes and just round and round. And my brother Robin, when I was, I don't know, about 5 years old, so he was about 17, he got this and he put it on repeat on the record player for a whole day. And that kind of earworm hook pornography, it's a part of art. It's something, you know, even the Monkees refused to record Sugar Sugar, you know, I mean, there are limits.
I mean, you know, they always call it earworm, but I thought I like them sort of brain parasites, you know. Most unpleasant thing they stick on you, so, you know, songs that as you die you want to hold on to the songs that you love, and then at the moment of death the last thing you fucking remember is just
chirpy chirpy cheep cheep.
Yeah, exactly. And you're just like, are you serious? This is what you've done to me, you know. It's not going to be Bach or something, you know, that feels like transcendence. And even if, you know, you die and there's nothing, as I sort of believe, you know, and you don't go to heaven, you know, I'd like to at least have that in my head as I'm dying, but it's not going to be that. It's going to be some very annoying mid-20-year-old woman sort of singing really nasally some awful tune that I just couldn't get out of my head.
Or mid-year going, oh, Vienna.
Yeah. is just a very funny image to me. And it's interesting you mentioned transcendence, because I think this is something, I would agree with, naturally, the transcendence as being a very important aspect of a piece of art. And it strikes me that all the best analyses of art, so when there is chatter, and it's really well thought out, and it's well done critical analysis of pieces of art and stuff, it doesn't explain that part. If anything, it sort of instrumentalizes a fantastic thing, right? So I mean, for me, Walter Benjamin did a bit of this. And it takes a piece of art and then it uses it to construct its own ideas, which in themselves contain something of that transcendence and wonder and awe within them. So it sort of just transfers this unexplainable space into a new host body, essentially. It was still there. We still don't understand. Now, instead of not understanding why the painting makes me feel, now I don't understand why the space of writing makes me go, and that's because it's so, the experience is the visceral part. We can't explain that. It's similar to the, when philosophers of mind like Daniel Dennett sort of ignore the hard problem of consciousness. It's like, no, you can't ignore the fact that I'm having phenomenal experiences. In the same way in art, you can't ignore the phenomenal experience that you have when you really connect with a piece of art. And that's something that is totally unique and individual, but also it seems like it coalesces around certain artifacts and things that we find in culture, the reason why, well, as we said, sort of beyond words.
Beyond words. And I think one important aspect of the whole experience is the interface.
Mm-hmm.
That art is something, for me, you look at a Michelangelo, his David, or the Della Rovere Chapel, as I like to think about it. I was recently told that because I'd been paid to do something, I couldn't call it my work. And it made me think about the Della Rovere Chapel,
Mm-hmm.
Which that artist bloke Michelangelo did. But it should be called Della Rovere because he paid for it, the Pope, the Sistine Chapel. But these things, these wild, overwhelming things are about a human being who has achieved a level of virtuosity that is so intense. But still, what is important is what happens at the interface between that work of art and the person admiring it. When Joyce finished Finnegan's Wake, he said, "This will keep the critics busy for 200 years." When he was reading the proofs to Ulysses, the typist had made a host of errors, and he had it read out to him. And there was this phrase that if he liked the typographical error, he'd say, "Let it stand."
Mm-hmm.
And apparently a great deal of what we have, even in the famous 1922 Ulysses, is actually stuff that was accidental. And Joyce said, it doesn't matter what I intended to say.
Mm-hmm.
It matters what you decipher from the text. Now, I've had a very strange variant on this experience in reading through a novel that I wrote called Voodoo Child's Slight Return, which makes Jimi Hendrix come back from the dead as a character in a novel, which seemed like an interesting idea. I'd seen Play It Again, Sam by Woody Allen, and thought I'll do something deep like that. And the peculiarity was rereading the book to reissue it years after writing it and seeing things in it that I hadn't noticed. Now, if you as the author can do that, then art then starts to happen at the interface, that the appreciation of the audience becomes very important, and interpretation then, and accepting that your interpretation won't be the same as James Joyce's, and that that can add artistry, it can add something to it, and encouraging people to do that, rather than when I was at the Jackson Pollock exhibition in London, there was I wrote a piece about it called Some of It's Thick, which is on an old abandoned website from 15 years ago now, johnatek.com. It's a great title. But I was stood behind this woman, and she got this 6-year-old child, and what a thing to do to a 6-year-old child. And she'd asked for the child's opinion of the Pollock, which was, blue poles or lavender mist. It was one of the famous, grotty, horrible thing. It's, and the child said, some of it's thick. And it just struck me that this, it was one of those kind of Richard Brautigan moments where, he's walking along behind a mother and child, and all he hears is the child say, it was a high building in Singapore. And it was one of those moments for me, where a crack opened and light poured through. This 6-year-old child had actually figured out what Jackson Pollock was up to. It's like, yeah, some of it's thick. But what happens is what happens at the interface. I've spent so much time standing behind people in galleries where you've got two people and one of them's the expert. So there was a show of Monet series paintings at the Royal Academy many years ago. And I'm wandering around, and what I do is I walk around fairly quickly so that I can see what I'm going to want to look at, because I'll only have time to look at 3 or 4 things in any depth. And there were 2 things. One of them was the Rouen Cathedral facades of somewhere around about 1890. And he'd got a room looking straight into the facade of the cathedral, because things were built a bit too close together in those days. And so instead of having to have a wheelbarrow full of wet oil paintings to change over every half hour, which is what he'd done from the Populous series and the Haystacks on, I don't know how, juggling feet with oil, it takes 3 days to dry. And he'd be going out, oh, it's 6:30 now, I've got to put this one up. Now he'd got a window, and a nice dry room in which to do it. So the Rouen Cathedral, and he said he wanted to paint the atmosphere 1 inch in front of the stone. Mm-hmm. That was the, he wasn't painting a picture of the stone, he was painting the color that time of day. One of those paintings really struck me. And so I came back to it, and there was the expert explaining to the person that Monet's technique was a bit rough at times, because what Monet had done was he'd taken the lead white 1-inch brush and he brushed the canvas down and then left it to dry so he could then scumble over the lines. Mm-hmm. And he'd just leave the end of the brush mark. Now for me, I'm looking at this thing and I'm in a state of bliss. I've got an expert explaining what a poor painter he was. The other painting in that show was a drum bridge at Giverny, Japanese drum bridge at Giverny. Mm-hmm. And it was in spring with the willow tree just beginning to erupt. And these were the 2 paintings that just completely bowled me away. So I'm stood looking at that. And again, some other expert tells his colleague that Monet wasn't really that good at perspective. So it is all a matter of perspective, I think, is the point that comes out.
That's the real thing when you really like something and you look at the critical criticism and everyone goes, this is terrible, it's got no value. You go, oh, damn.
I'm worthless.
Yeah. You go, no, actually, I'm thinking about this all wrong. But you're still a social creature, so you still have the insecurity that comes with it,
Yeah, absolutely. And isn't it so frequent? It's like people go on about the first night of The Rite of Spring. Indeed, there's a wonderful TV piece called Riot at the Rite. And because Nijinsky did what he did, and there was a battle broke out in the audience. People were actually hitting each other over the thing. What they don't say is that when it was released purely a week later as a piece of music without the ballet, it had a rapturous response. So the problem was Nijinsky, who of course had said, when Stravinsky said to him, "You're not dancing in time," he said, "What does it matter as long as we end on the same beat?" Different views of art there.
Senior school choir director,
Senior school choir director, yeah.
Start in the same place, end in the same place. What happens in the middle? Who cares, But it sounds good then. I remember someone telling me that actually when I sang in choir at school. Very funny.
Those are the days.
I mean, it's true. You do sound better if you start together and end together, generally speaking. But also, the stuff in the middle matters.
A little bit,
yeah.
In fact, I think that's probably what we should call this. We should call this talk "The Stuff in the Middle Matters." Yes. But there any other thoughts sparkling in your brain, or shall we pause and have a hiatus and return at a later date?
There are, but I feel like it would probably be better to end this here. Otherwise, I will talk for the next 2 or 3 hours about this, because I'm only just getting started, which is always a good sign to stop, actually, which I think is something Stravinsky said, interestingly enough. Never start when you're stuck. Never stop when you're stuck. Always stop when you're in full flow, because then, you know, you won't be afraid that you can't do it tomorrow.
It's something some novelists say, that when you know what the next paragraph is, it's time to stop, because the hardest point, as you know, is getting up the next day and pushing on. So, you know, and so yeah, I think you're probably right. So we'll end the conversation here. I found this fascinating. I've now got to go and listen to a load of Schoenberg and stuff, which I've been avoiding all my life. But you know, we'll resume in about a month's time and baffle the children some more then.
Yeah, start with a Verklachten Act, and then sort of, you know, which I think, sorry, just very quickly, the funny thing about Schoenberg, you know, Verklachten Act, his piece.
I don't know.
Fantastic piece, genuinely, because it's not atonal yet. This is still tonal territory. Because Schoenberg was a master of tonal composition, like absolute genius at it. And Verklachten Act is one of his more tonal pieces. So it's very late romantic.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about Schoenberg, people who talk about Schoenberg in classical music in general, everyone's favorite piece is Verklachten Act, because it's just on the threshold where people can accept it. It's just edgy enough, but also it sounds quite nice to them, which I always thought was quite funny. But yeah, I'll leave it on that.
Okay, well, we'll leave everybody with that. It's been fantastic talking with you, Rio, and we'll carry on further.
Fantastic as always. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I'm John Atack, Rio Harada-Parr.
Thank you.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
Just shut up talking and play.